bandich. Naomi Brooks stepped onto the plane with an air of quiet confidence, her eyes calmly scanning the first-class cabin. She was dressed in a sleek blazer, her natural curls framing her sharp features. In one hand, she carried a high-end leather bag, inside of which was the laptop she planned to use to catch up on work during the long flight. Everything seemed routine. No one on board had any reason to believe that in just a few minutes, something would happen that would change everything. Naomi smoothly placed her bag in the overhead compartment before settling into her seat, fastening her seatbelt with ease. She opened her laptop, scrolling through emails, her focus entirely on her work. That was when a flight attendant appeared beside her. Lindsay Harper, a woman in her early 30s, dressed in a crisp uniform, with a rigid posture and sharp, assessing eyes. She studied Naomi for a moment before leaning slightly forward. Her voice was polite, yet there was something beneath it, something calculating. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I need to check your ticket." Naomi looked up, slightly surprised, but remained composed. Without hesitation, she retrieved her boarding pass and handed it to Lindsay. The flight attendant glanced at the ticket, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. A brief moment passed, but something in her expression made Naomi realize this wasn't just a routine ticket check. Lindsay returned the ticket without another word, her face unreadable. Straightening up, she cast a quick glance around the first-class cabin before silently walking away. Naomi shrugged, dismissing the interaction as a random security measure. What she didn't know was that in just a few minutes, Lindsay would return, and this time she wouldn't be nearly as courteous. Naomi Brooks had no idea that she was about to be thrust into a situation no one could have predicted. And in just 7 minutes, this flight, and even the entire airline, would never be the same again. She closed her laptop with a soft click, exhaled slowly, and turned her gaze to the window. The plane had yet to take off, and passengers were still settling into their seats. She tried to shake off the strange feeling left by Lindsay Harper's scrutinizing stare and redirected her attention to work. But only a few minutes later, a shadow fell over her once more. Naomi looked up again, and there was Lindsay, back with a far more serious expression. This time she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a middle-aged male flight attendant, his salt and pepper hair giving him an air of experience. He seemed hesitant, as though aware that whatever was about to happen wasn't entirely right. But Lindsay spoke first. "Miss Brooks, I need you to come with me to the front of the cabin for a moment." Her voice was still polite, but there was something in her tone, something firm, something final. Naomi's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem?" Lindsay pressed her lips together. "There's just a small issue with your seat. We need to verify some information." Naomi studied her for a moment, then shifted her gaze to the male attendant standing behind her. He looked uncomfortable, but he didn't intervene. Something was definitely wrong. Sensing that something was off, Naomi closed her laptop, picked up her bag, and stood up. Around her, a few passengers began to notice the growing tension. She had no intention of making a scene, but she also wasn't going to be treated unfairly without a clear explanation. She followed Lindsay toward the small galley area, a space where few passengers could overhear their conversation. When they stopped, Lindsay turned to face her, this time with a completely different demeanor. "I'm afraid there's been a booking error," Lindsay said, crossing her arms. "Your first-class seat was mistakenly assigned during confirmation, and we need to move you to economy." Naomi blinked. "A booking error?" She repeated each word deliberately, as if making sure she had heard correctly. Lindsay nodded. "We reviewed the system, and it looks like you were incorrectly placed in first class. We'll find another seat for you in the main cabin." Naomi let the words hang in the air for a few seconds before slowly shaking her head. "There's no mistake," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "I booked my first-class ticket weeks ago, received confirmation via email, and I have both my receipt and my valid boarding pass. If there was an error, it was on the airline's end, not mine." Lindsay's lips curled slightly, but something flickered in her eyes. Hesitation, maybe even doubt. "We've looked into it thoroughly," Lindsay replied, her voice a touch quieter. "I'm afraid this seat just isn't suitable for you." Naomi tilted her head. "Not suitable for me?" A long silence stretched between them. Naomi held Lindsay's gaze, studying the subtle changes in her expression. The polite words were just a mask. Naomi had seen people like her before, those who believed she didn't belong in certain spaces, no matter how qualified she was to be there. A quiet sigh escaped from behind Lindsay. The older male flight attendant, who had remained silent up to this point, seemed like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Naomi's grip on her bag tightened slightly, but she refused to let her emotions take over. Lifting her chin, she spoke with unwavering clarity. "I paid for my seat. I won't move just because you feel that I don't belong here." Lindsay's fingers curled into fists at her sides, and for the first time her confidence faltered. "You have two choices," she said, her voice lower, colder. "You can move now, or I'll call security to assist you." The air in the galley grew heavier. Naomi inhaled deeply, her eyes narrowing slightly. She now understood. This wasn't just about a seat. This was a test, and Lindsay wanted to see if she would back down. Naomi didn't answer right away. She simply looked at Lindsay, a faint, knowing smile flickering across her lips, as if she had just made a decision. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to act. Naomi slightly tilted her head, a spark of something unreadable flashing in her eyes. "All right," she said smoothly, lifting her bag and turning toward the economy section. But before she left, her hand slipped into her pocket, pulling out her phone. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen, composing a message. As she hit send, the smallest hint of a smirk crossed her face. Lindsay might have thought she had won, but in just 7 minutes she would realize the game hadn't even begun. Naomi walked down the narrow aisle of the economy cabin, keeping her head high. Nearby passengers glanced at her with mixed expressions, some curious, some indifferent, some exchanging knowing looks. None of them knew what had just happened in first class. None of them knew she had just been removed from the seat she had legally paid for. She reached her newly assigned seat, cramped in the middle row, wedged between two strangers. No more spacious legroom, no more privacy, no more comfort she had rightfully expected. Naomi sat down, placing her bag beneath the seat in front of her and fastening her seatbelt as if nothing had happened, but in her mind, her thoughts were racing. She wasn't angry in the way most people might expect. There was no shouting, no heated argument. But humiliation had a way of cutting deep, like a blade pressed too close to pride. She had faced challenges like this before. She had spent years overcoming silent judgments, unspoken biases, and casual dismissals. But this time was different. This time she wasn't just another passenger subjected to unfair treatment. This time she had power, and she intended to use it. Taking a slow, steady breath, Naomi pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her finger hovered over a name before pressing it. She typed a short but deliberate message. "I just encountered an issue on this flight. Keep an eye on it immediately." She hit send and placed the phone in her lap, her face unreadable. Beside her, the man in the window seat turned slightly, casting her a glance of concern. He was in his 50s, dressed in a gray button-down shirt, his expression hesitant. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but sincere. Naomi turned to him, offering a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you." The man nodded, but he lingered for a moment, as if sensing that there was more to the story. Naomi, however, said nothing more, because she knew things were already in motion. "Are you all right?" the man beside her asked gently, his voice calm yet sincere. Naomi turned to him, offering a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you." He nodded but lingered for a moment longer than usual, as if sensing something wasn't quite right. But Naomi didn't elaborate. At the front of the plane, Lindsay Harper returned to the first-class cabin, slipping seamlessly back into her duties. She poured a glass of wine for a passenger, exchanged light conversation with a businessman in a tailored suit, then let her gaze sweep over the cabin with apparent satisfaction. But just seconds later, the chime of the internal phone echoed from the galley. A call from airline operations. Lindsay picked up the receiver, bringing it to her ear. "This is Lindsay Harper." The voice on the other end was steady but firm. "We've received a report regarding your flight. Passenger Naomi Brooks. Can you explain why she was moved to economy?" Lindsay's expression shifted instantly. She glanced around as if worried someone might overhear. Swallowing hard, she responded in the calmest voice she could manage. "It was just a minor mix-up. I'm handling the situation." A silence stretched on the other end of the line before the voice returned, sharper this time. "We certainly hope so. But be advised, this flight is under close observation." The call ended, but the weight of those words lingered in Lindsay's mind. She tightened her grip on the phone, feeling the sweat beginning to form on her palms. Naomi Brooks wasn't just any passenger, and Lindsay had just made a mistake she couldn't yet comprehend. Naomi placed her phone down, the corner of her lips curling into the faintest smirk. She didn't need to do anything else. Things were already in motion, and it was only a matter of time before everything unfolded as planned. She leaned back in her seat, silently taking in her surroundings. Economy was far more cramped than first class, but she didn't let it bother her. Right now, all she needed was patience. At that moment, another flight attendant approached her, a young woman with neatly tied brown hair and a warm, friendly expression. "Excuse me, ma'am, is there anything I can get for you?" she asked, her voice much softer than Lindsay's had been. Naomi looked up, reading the sincerity in her eyes. She shook her head gently. "No, thank you, I'm all right." But the flight attendant hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice slightly. "If you need anything, just let me know. My name is Sophie." Naomi studied her for a moment before giving her a small nod. "Thank you, Sophie." Sophie smiled before walking away, leaving Naomi alone with her thoughts. Back in first class, Lindsay Harper returned to her station, but the confidence she once carried had begun to fade. She forced herself to focus, checking meals, assisting passengers, but her mind was trapped in the conversation she had just had. It wasn't just the phone call that unsettled her. It was the way it had been delivered. A vague but unmistakable warning. This flight is under close observation. Who was watching? And more importantly, why did they care about a passenger like Naomi Brooks? A sense of unease began creeping into Lindsay's chest, but she had no time to dwell on it. Because just moments later, another chime rang from the galley phone. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't just issuing a warning. It carried urgency. "Lindsay Harper, we've received a direct call from the board of directors. They're requesting an immediate report on the situation with passenger Naomi Brooks." Lindsay's breath caught. The board of directors? Her eyes flicked toward the economy cabin, where Naomi still sat calmly, as if she were entirely unaware of the storm brewing around her. But Lindsay was beginning to realize something. Naomi wasn't just a passenger. She was someone with influence, someone with power, and she seemed to know exactly what she was doing. As Lindsay tried to piece together what was happening, a message lit up on Naomi's phone. She glanced down, reading the short, precise text from a high-priority contact. "They've received the report, monitoring closely, awaiting your signal." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting back toward first class. Lindsay Harper thought she had handled the situation, but Naomi knew better. The real battle hadn't even begun. Lindsay Harper placed the phone down, her fingers unconsciously gripping the edge of the galley counter. Her heart was beating faster than usual. A call from the board of directors? Over a single passenger relocation? Her breath was unsteady. Something was very, very wrong. This wasn't normal. No one from the board of directors would take an interest in a minor seating issue, unless that passenger wasn't just an ordinary traveler. Lindsay tried to steady herself, inhaling deeply before glancing toward the economy cabin. Naomi Brooks was still seated there, her expression as composed as ever, as if nothing had happened. But now, Lindsay wasn't so sure anymore. She turned back to her duties, forcing herself to go through the motions as if everything was normal. But deep down, she knew the undercurrents had started to shift. Meanwhile, Naomi flicked her eyes toward the clock on the screen in front of her. Nearly 7 minutes had passed. She picked up her phone and typed a short message. "Continue monitoring. Report back as needed." As soon as the message was sent, a soft chime echoed through the plane's speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to remind you that our flight is currently undergoing a routine service evaluation. If you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to inform our crew." Naomi smiled slightly. She knew this wasn't a standard announcement. This was a signal. The board was directly overseeing the flight now. In the galley, a senior flight attendant, Robert, stepped up beside Lindsay. He had been in the airline industry for over 20 years, and the moment he saw the look on her face, he knew something was off. "What's going on?" Robert asked, his voice calm but probing. Lindsay shook her head, forcing a neutral expression. "Nothing, just a minor issue with the passenger's seating." Robert didn't look convinced. He crossed his arms, his sharp gaze never leaving her. "You mean the passenger you just moved to economy?" Lindsay stiffened. "How do you know about that?" Robert shrugged. "I've been in this business long enough to know when something isn't right, especially when operations calls directly while we're still in the air." Lindsay swallowed hard. "It's just a small mix-up." Robert sighed, shaking his head. "If it's a small mix-up, then why did the board request an immediate report?" His words landed like a punch to Lindsay's stomach. She stood frozen, realization creeping in. Meanwhile, Naomi set her phone down, idly running a fingertip along the rim of her water glass. She didn't need to do anything else. She had already planted the seeds. Now, all she had to do was wait for them to take root. From a distance, Naomi could see Lindsay's reaction. The way tension lined her movements, the way her eyes kept darting toward the economy cabin. Lindsay may have been confident in her decision at first, but now doubt had started to creep in. Naomi took a deep breath, then turned to Sophie, the young flight attendant who had shown concern earlier. "Sophie." The young woman paused, turning to Naomi with a friendly expression. "Yes?" Naomi offered a small, knowing smile. "Can you do me a tiny favor?" Sophie nodded, listening attentively. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice still calm, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "Pay attention to what happens next." Sophie blinked, her lips parting slightly as if to ask something, but before she could, Naomi had already leaned back into her seat. She picked up her phone once more, fingers poised as if preparing for the next move. The psychological battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Lindsay Harper tried to steady herself as she returned to the first-class cabin, but she could feel her pulse quickening. She kept telling herself this was just a minor issue, that no one would care about a single passenger being reassigned. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Since receiving that call from the board of directors, she could no longer deny it. Something much bigger was unfolding. They hadn't called just to remind her of standard procedures. They were watching, and she was at the center of their scrutiny. Lindsay glanced around, forcing herself to act normal. She continued pouring drinks for first-class passengers, offering them polite smiles. But her hands trembled ever so slightly as she set a glass down. Then, a deep voice spoke near her ear. "Lindsay." She turned sharply and found Robert, the senior flight attendant, standing in front of her, arms crossed. His gaze was sharp, piercing, like he could see right through her. "Did you really think you could keep this quiet?" he asked, his tone slow and deliberate, yet heavy with meaning. Lindsay furrowed her brows, trying to appear unfazed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Robert didn't take his eyes off her. "The board of directors is monitoring this flight, and they've requested a detailed report on what just happened with the passenger in economy." Lindsay felt as though the floor beneath her had just been pulled away. They're really watching?" she stammered. Robert raised an eyebrow. "What do you think? A passenger gets bumped to economy because of your feeling, and suddenly the board wants a full report? You messed with the wrong person." Lindsay stood frozen. She had assumed Naomi Brooks was just another well-dressed professional. A successful traveler perhaps, but nothing special. But now, everything was spiraling out of control. In the economy cabin, Naomi remained as composed as ever, her fingers resting lightly on her phone screen. A new message appeared. "Report is being processed. The CEO has been notified." She allowed herself a small smile, but she didn't rush. Everything was unfolding exactly as expected. Just then, a young flight attendant rushed into the galley, her face tense. She stopped in front of Robert and whispered something in his ear. Robert nodded before turning to Lindsay. "You need to meet with the executive team, immediately." Lindsay stiffened. "Right now?" Robert nodded. "Right now." Her breathing grew heavier. For the first time since the flight began, she realized she was no longer in control. As Lindsay left the first-class cabin, she couldn't stop herself from glancing toward economy. Naomi was still there, seated calmly. But there was something in her eyes, something powerful, something chilling, that made Lindsay's stomach twist. quiet, unshakable confidence. Lindsay swallowed hard. She knew she had just made an irreversible mistake. Lindsay Harper took a deep breath as she stepped through the door into the front galley, where a meeting she never wanted was already waiting for her. 3 figures stood before her, among them Dennis Carter, the airline CEO, and Emma Reynolds, head of service quality control. These were not people who typically showed up on a commercial flight, not unless something serious had happened. Dennis's voice was deep, authoritative. "Lindsay Harper," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Would you care to explain why passenger Naomi Brooks was moved to economy?" Lindsay felt her heart pounding inside her chest. She glanced around, hoping to find an escape route, but there wasn't one. I thought there was a mistake," she stammered. "I suspected she was in the wrong seat, so I double-checked." Emma narrowed her eyes. "But she presented a valid first-class ticket, didn't she?" Lindsay stayed silent. Dennis folded his arms. "Can you tell us the real reason you asked her to move?" Lindsay opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because no matter what excuse she came up with, the truth wouldn't change. She had made a decision based on bias, not policy. In the economy cabin, Naomi Brooks watched from a distance, her sharp gaze following Lindsay's every move. She had seen this before, the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored. Naomi picked up her phone and typed one final message. "It's time." A few seconds later, the airplane's speaker system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to inform you that this flight is currently undergoing a special service evaluation. We kindly ask all crew members to cooperate with our oversight team to ensure the highest standards of service." Passengers started whispering among themselves, wondering what was happening. Naomi, however, remained silent, just watching. Lindsay turned to Dennis, panic flashing across her face. "You can't be serious about this. I was just following my instincts," she protested. Dennis took a slow, steady breath before responding. "The board of directors has received a formal complaint from one of our most important stakeholders. The same person you kicked out of first class for no valid reason." Lindsay blinked. "Stakeholder?" Emma nodded. "Naomi Brooks isn't just an ordinary passenger. She's one of the airline's largest investors." The words hit Lindsay like a slap to the face. Her complexion paled, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. She hadn't just mistreated a random passenger. She had mistreated someone who had a say in the very airline she worked for. Back in economy, Naomi calmly lifted her glass of water, taking a small sip. She knew this battle was already won. The only question left was, what would Lindsay do now that she realized she had already lost? Lindsay Harper stood frozen, her lips parted, but no words came out. Her mind was racing, but it was too late. She had misjudged Naomi Brooks completely. Not just as a first-class traveler, not just as a successful woman, but as someone with real power. And now, because of one rash decision, her career could be over the moment this plane landed. Dennis Carter stared at her before pulling out his phone. "The moment we land, I want you to report to HR," he said, his voice heavy. "You're being placed on suspension pending a full investigation." Lindsay opened her mouth to protest, but Emma Reynolds shook her head. "This isn't just about one passenger," she said firmly. "Your actions today have put the airline's reputation at risk. You need to prepare yourself." Lindsay's shoulders slumped. She had nothing left to say. In economy, Naomi leaned back into her seat, watching the fallout unfold. She didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for itself. She wasn't out for revenge. She believed in accountability. Because if she stayed silent today, she knew there would be another passenger, another flight, another Lindsay Harper making the same mistake. A little while later, Sophie approached Naomi, her expression hesitant. "Would you like to return to your original seat?" she asked. Naomi looked at the young flight attendant and offered a small, genuine smile. "No need, Sophie. I got exactly what I came for." Sophie nodded, then whispered, "Thank you for speaking up." Naomi gave her a small nod in return, then turned back to the window. The plane continued on its course. But for Lindsay, the future had never been more uncertain. As the flight landed, passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, collecting their belongings, and filing off the plane. Naomi didn't rush. She waited until the crowd had thinned before gracefully standing, picking up her sleek leather bag. As she stepped off the plane, she glanced toward the front of the aircraft, where a group of airline executives, including Dennis, Emma, and HR representatives, stood waiting for Lindsay. Her face was pale as she followed them off the plane, her head lowered, avoiding eye contact. And just before Naomi exited the cabin, she paused, turning her gaze directly toward Lindsay. Lindsay finally lifted her gaze, her eyes clouded with confusion and regret. Naomi met her stare and spoke only one sentence. Judge people by their actions, not by where you think they belong. She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Lindsay standing there, swallowing the weight of her mistake. The storm had passed, but the lesson would remain. What do you think about this story? Did Naomi handle the situation the right way? And if you were in Lindsay's position, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next powerful story. Let's spread awareness about fairness, respect, and accountability together. See you in the next story on Aiva Stories.